the Body Ecology Diet Starter Culture. And to use this culture, it's a powder. You need to put it into a little bowl of warm water, the whole packet. And then you have to mix some kind of sugar in with it. I'm using honey. You just need about a half a teaspoon. You can use maple syrup, you can use regular sugar, rapadura, just a little bit of sugar that will help start to feed the culture, and the sugar will all disappear. It'll be eaten up by the sauerkraut culture, so there'll be no sugar in your final product, but you just need it to get the culture started. So you mix it in, and then this needs to sit for at least 20 minutes. So honey's a little hard. Just gonna mix it till it's all dissolved. And that's step one. So when you make sauerkraut or when you make fermented vegetables, you want to make sure that everything you use is disinfected. So what I'm doing right here, this is a jar that I was just boiling, and you put your jars that you're going to put it into. You can run them through a dishwasher, and that's one way to disinfect them. You can soak them in like a bleach solution with bleach and water. You can scald them by pouring boiling hot water on them, or you can actually boil them. That's what I was doing, boiling them in a pot. And then they're real hot, so of course you need to let them cool down before you actually put the sauerkraut in, because the heat will kill the culture. But you want to make sure that all your surfaces are completely disinfected. So, for example, it's not very clean now because I'm using it, but I poured boiling water over my knives and my cutting board before using them as well. So you just want to make sure that everything is totally disinfected. And I'll just talk a little bit about what these fermented vegetables are and why we're making them. So it's an old way of preserving food from before there was refrigeration. And you add something, some kind of culture, to the vegetable, and then you seal it in an airtight container. That's the basic process. And you can use, we're using the culture from the Body Ecology Diet by Donna Gates, but you can use whey as your culture starter, and you can actually, with certain vegetables like cabbage, and I understand even other types of vegetables, have already the enzymes in them, so that if you don't have a culture starter, they can still make fermented vegetables or sauerkraut, but if you use the culture starter, you'll have less of a chance of contamination with bad bacteria. So that's why we're doing all of this process of scalding and disinfecting everything, is to reduce any possibility of contamination, because sometimes you can get mold or something on your fermented vegetables, and you'll be able to see if it's on there. But using a culture and disinfecting everything reduces the chances of that. And the culture also adds some beneficial organisms and beneficial enzymes to the fermented vegetables. So that's it for that section. Okay, so we're going to make today fermented vegetables with, got a bunch of things here, purple cabbage, Savoy cabbage, daikon, green cabbage, and then here I've got kohlrabi that's been peeled and chopped. So you can do this by hand. I've done it before. It's a long process, but it's a lot easier if you do it in a food processor. So that's what we're going to do today. And you know, of course, there's many different kinds of food processors. You just need to cut everything to the size that will work with your food processor. And to prepare it, we're using the shredder blade. It's going to shred everything. And if you chop it by hand, or when you chop it in the food processor, you need a very thin, you need everything chopped very thin. So, put this back on. So to cut the vegetables to make fermented vegetables, you want to start with big pieces that are more manageable. And for cabbage, we're going to put some leaves from the cabbage on the top of our jar. This is the jar that we're going to be fermenting the vegetables in. And what you do on the top of it, and we'll show this completely later, but you take a leaf from the cabbage and you roll it up, and then that's going to go on the top of your fermented vegetables. It absorbs some of the gases. So you just want to make sure to set a few leaves aside. You don't need very many. And then I'll just show you how it turns out if you do it in the food processor. You know, you get a nice even texture like this and really very fine. And of course you can also do that by hand. I've done it by hand many times. Good exercise. And I can just demonstrate that in case anybody wants to know. So you just cut it very thin. See, it's a nice fine texture as well. And it's a lot harder with other vegetables that are more solid to do by hand. You can do these in the food processor as well. If you want to do them by hand, you need a grater. And this is kohlrabi. And then that's what you get from the grater. Very similar to the food processor. And so in this batch of fermented vegetables, we're combining everything that I showed. So we're combining the green cabbage, the purple cabbage, and the kohlrabi are all together. And then I'm also putting some other things in there. You don't need anything else. That's enough, just as that is. But I like to add a little of some nice flavors to the sauerkraut. So this is some dry rosemary. And I'm just going to mix that in as well. And I'm going to put in a little bit of ginger. So this I'm going to grate by hand on my hand grater. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You can add other things like juniper berries are really good, caraway seed, dill seed, cumin seeds, any kind of spices that are like a seed. You wouldn't want to add the powder. Or herbs, you could add like oregano, fresh or dried, of any herbs. Sometimes I add lavender, that adds a really nice flavor. Let's see, what else can you use? You could put in mint, you could put in parsley, you could put in cilantro chopped really finely, anything that you like, nice herb that you want to add. And I wanted to mention also that cabbage is the traditional vegetable for sauerkraut. And if you have difficulty eating cabbage or digesting cabbage, you don't need to worry about it with this process, because it actually, all of the gassiness and the rough texture of the cabbage is taken out after it's done fermenting. So, and you've got a nice combination of all your vegetables, and then you're ready to mix it all up. So I'm going to go on to the next step.
Wait.
Oh. So I'm going to talk a little bit about using some things in your fermented vegetables that maybe you were going to throw away, or vegetables that you might not be familiar with. So one thing is chard, and a lot of times people just use the leaves of the chard to make like steamed greens or something like that, and then they throw away the stem. But you don't have to throw away the stem. It's actually really useful, and one of the things that you can use it for is to make fermented vegetables, because fermented vegetables, they turn out a lot better when they're made with something kind of that has some structure to it, some hardness to it. You can add something like the chard leaves that are soft, but you wouldn't make like a whole batch from these because it would be too soft. It would be really mushy. So you can use this stem and just keep it as it is. And I'm going to just show you how to do this by hand. We would just do it again like the cabbage. Or you can just stick it in your food processor. Can you see the food processor? Mm-hmm. You can just stick it in your food processor and shred it just like you did with the cabbage. And then you put that in with everything else. And then this is another thing you could use. These are the greens from daikon. They're good to eat and in salads and whatever, but you don't get much leaf off of it. So you can just put this whole thing in there. A little bit of leaves in the sauerkraut is fine. It's good. And just put those in. And just for fun, I'll show you. This is the daikon that we're using. A nice big daikon. And daikons are great. They're a really good cleansing vegetable. So they're great to include, but they're kind of spicy. So you don't want to probably do all daikon, but it's good to mix in with your fermented vegetables. And you can also do, I've done this with broccoli leaves. Sometimes the broccoli has lots of leaves on it and you don't know what to do with it. You can add it to your fermented vegetables too. Almost any kind of greens or leaves from a plant can go in there. And of course the stems as well. So those are some options of the many, many things you can add to your fermented vegetables. Okay? So what I'm doing now is just mixing together everything. So I didn't put everything through the food processor at the same time. So we've got like the ginger on top, the cabbage and the daikon on the side. So I'm just mixing it all, and I've got 2 different bowls. I'm going to have to mix stuff back in to this bowl. So just want to make sure that everything, all of your vegetables are evenly mixed. If you're only using one kind of vegetable, like just cabbage, you don't have to worry about that, obviously. I just want to have a nice even content throughout so that all my jars are the same. And next we're going to show how to pack it in the jars. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is make the brine, which we used, remember, the starter culture from the body ecology diet. And I'm going to mention again that you don't need this. You could use whey, which is the liquid part of milk after you make cheese or yogurt. And if you have a container of yogurt and there's a liquid on the top, that's the whey. You only need about 2 tablespoons of whey for like a whole batch of sauerkraut. Other things you can use, sometimes people use salt. Normally people will add salt to their fermented vegetables, and the salt inhibits growth of bad bacteria, but we don't recommend it because it can inhibit some of the growth of the beneficial bacteria as well. If you want salt in your sauerkraut, in your fermented vegetables, you can add it later when you eat it. But if you add it before fermenting, you don't get as much benefit from the fermented vegetables. So if you were using whey, if you were using salt and water, you would do the same thing. You'd have a little bit of liquid, and then you just want to mix that up with some of your vegetables. And I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it. So one way is going to be with the hand blender. You just put it in there and mix. You can see it's all chopped real small. Right there. The other way is to just chop by hand some of what you've already done. So I've got this that's chopped already real fine, and what you would do is you'd go through it with a knife and make it even smaller. Can you see that? much as you can. Just keep chopping until it's teeny, teeny, tiny. And then you add that in with your liquid. So then you've got this liquid, and this is our nice live cultures that's going to make this fermented vegetables really good. And so you just want to take that, and I have 3 separate bowls here, so I'm just going to do evenly distribute it. And so I'm just going to put a little bit into my first bowl that I'm going to use. And I put in about 2 tablespoons, and then mix it all in. And just to mention a little bit about the reason why we eat these fermented vegetables is they have so much of the beneficial enzymes and bacteria that our bodies need, and it supports good digestion. It's really good to eat with other foods to help digest and assimilate the nutrients in the foods. And it helps to support your immune system. It helps to build a healthy immune system. If you've been taking antibiotics or something like that, you can eat this and it'll help to build back your flora in your gut. So to put this in a jar, when we put it in, we pack it down really tight. You can stop.
Gayatri, how do you know how much starter to use for what quantity of vegetables?
Well, that's a good question. Normally, when I used to use salt, I would do like 2 tablespoons of salt for like 3 large cabbages. That's not very scientific. It just was based on some things I had read. This is, there's a recipe from Body Ecology Diet with using this culture that I think it's 2 large cabbages for the packet. The thing about the culture is like, it's like a boost. It's like an added thing. So you actually could make it without any culture at all. So it kind of goes a long way. Basically, mix it in, it goes a long way. You can do like a big, huge batch of it and don't worry too much about having just the right proportion of the starter. And the same thing with whey, like usually it's like everything is always 2 tablespoons, all the recipes that I've seen. But they're not real specific about the proportion of how much vegetables to that.
And how much water would go in a jar or a big bowl of vegetables like that?
Yeah, so you don't want to use too much water because a lot of liquid's going to come out. I'm going to pound this in a minute, and a lot of liquid's going to come out. So you don't really want too much. But I used about 1/4 cup for all of this. And it was like, yeah, and this was like 3 cabbages, 1 really big one. Actually, it was 4. 1 really big one and 3 kind of smallish ones, and then some daikon. So, you know, kind of about that proportion. So this is my jar that I filled up, and once it's full, you start to pound it down. And that's what I was saying, you don't need, can you see this? Mm-hmm. You don't need a culture starter because the vegetables, and actually all vegetables have, you know, if they're live raw vegetables, they have enzymes naturally occurring in them. And what I'm doing here is pounding it, and that releases the enzymes from the vegetable. And a lot of water is going to come out, and you see it's coming, you got to pound it real hard. And so if you did it without any culture at all, you can still make sauerkraut, and I've done that before. I ended up with a little mold on top, but I just skimmed it off, and as long as there is no air, this is the fermentation process is anaerobic, so you don't want to have any air. As long as there's no air in the bottom part of it, it'll still ferment. But again, if you add the culture, it's a lot more beneficial, and you're a lot more certain of getting the product that you're going to get. So you can see as I'm pounding this, it's going down a lot. And you want to keep kind of pounding it until you feel like you can't really do it much anymore. And the water's going to come out, the vegetables are going to start to release liquid. And eventually you want to make this so that it's going to be completely covered with liquid on the top. And that is what's going to help get the airtightness. if it's all liquid all the way through it and all the way on the top, no oxygen can get in there. Okay, you can stop. Okay, so what to pound it with? Well, I'm using a rolling pin. This is actually like an old-fashioned rolling pin. It doesn't have any parts to it, so it's really nice. It's just really good for pounding it. Other things you could use would be like a wooden spatula. You can just use the end of it and pound it with that. I've heard people say a rubber mallet. I don't know how you would really get a rubber mallet into a jar, but that's one option, I guess. You can also use a spoon. Just take a spoon and press it with a spoon, but that probably won't be enough on its own. That'll get it somewhat packed in there. But you really need something, so, you know, the handle of something, or if you have a long, thin thing like this, you can really get in there and pound it. And certain vegetables will be more moist than others. So cabbage is a really good level of moisture for sauerkraut. It works really well. And when you mix in other things, then that changes a little bit. So like, and also if your cabbage is dry, you know, if it's been sitting out for a while, it'll be a little harder. But if you're using something like, it would be dry. Well, if I was using like carrots, maybe a little bit drier. Onion is really wet, so if you use just onion, you'll end up with lots of liquid, probably more than you want. So you wouldn't usually probably do just onion. So something that you can kind of experiment with. But again, you want to keep pounding it until this is starting to get nice and mushy. Wet, this is good cabbage. And then you just keep adding more, and you don't want your jar to be completely full. You need to leave about, so this is a quart jar. For a quart jar, you need to leave about 2 inches of space on the top, because once these start fermenting, there's going to be a lot of activity in there and it needs space. So I think you can stop and then... Okay, so I've been still just pounding this and pounding it, trying to stuff it all in here. And then I'm going to take my spoon and just push it in really good. So this cabbage seems to be a little bit dry, and it's not really, it's releasing liquid. It's definitely all liquid in there. Can you see how I'm getting it on the spoon? When I smush the spoon in, let's see. When I smush the spoon in, I get this liquid. That's a nice purple color from the purple cabbage. And that is what I was talking about, the liquid that releases from the vegetables that's going to put everything under water and make it nice and airtight. And I'm actually going to take a little bit out because I don't have 2 inches on the top, and with this culture it tends to overflow a lot, so I don't want to overflow too much. I'll just put that in another jar. I'm just measuring with my fingers. Usually 2 fingers is about 1 inch. So it's almost 2 inches there. It's probably close enough. This is a nice wide jar, so it's got a lot of space. And you want to have as little as possible of little pieces clinging to the sides, because those are going to just get oxidized. They're not going to be good sauerkraut or good cultured vegetables. I was talking before about the oxidation, so that can happen if it's left out and exposed to air, if the vegetables are left out. So once you've shredded all your vegetables, you want to get them into the jars right away and not let it sit, otherwise it can oxidize, and it won't hurt you, but it just loses some of the enzymes, some of the benefits, and you can see that it won't be as nice of a color if you do that. So I'm going to take some of my cabbage leaves, just need about half of that, and I'm going to roll it up real tight, and then that's going to go on the top. And you want to make sure that the jar is sealed, and then the jar, you just let it sit for at least 3 days, but it really, how long you need to let it sit kind of depends on the temperature of where you are, because if it's warm it goes faster, if it's colder it'll take longer. So I usually like to let mine sit for weeks. I mean, I'll let them sit up to 6 months and then eat it. I've even had some longer than that, even some that just sit for a year, and it just keeps getting more soft and cultured. It doesn't go bad, but you can experiment and see how you like it, because initially it's a little bit more crunchy, and later on it gets softer. I think the ideal, like, average to start with would be leaving it for like a week before you eat it. So you can see how this looks. Can you see it close?
Mm. Okay, beautiful.
Yeah, you can see that everything is packed really tight, so there's liquid between everything, so no air can get in there. And as this is sitting, it's probably going to bubble. There's probably going to come a lot of liquid on the top, and it could even overflow. So I'm going to let it sit inside a bowl or a plate for that week or longer as it ferments.
What about the temperature for the fermentation time?
Yeah, well, there's no particular temperature that it has to be. If it's extreme hot or cold, if extreme hot will kill the culture, extreme cold, it'll still grow. It can even grow in the fridge, but much, much slower. So if you're just keeping it like at room temperature, that's fine. Your house is usually between like 60, 70 degrees, that's fine. Ideally, you want it covered. You don't want it to be exposed to a lot of light. But if it has a little bit of light, it's okay, but it's not something that you would put out in the sun. So putting it like in a kitchen cupboard or a closet somewhere in your house would be a good place to do it.
Is the cabbage leaf completely covering, or is it just sitting there on top?
It just sits on top.
And
yeah,
it
it just absorbs as it releases gas. It absorbs that.
Very good. And what happens if you don't have a jar with a nice seal like that?
Oh, you can use any jar. So I have some here, just to screw on top. These are fine. I was reading about this actually the other day, because they were talking about what is the ideal cover, and some people use this method of like a plastic bag. They want it airtight and everything. And I've always just done it with just this kind of jar. And this was a blog, and I can't remember the name of it, that I was reading about fermented vegetables, but they said in the end that really all that matters is that it's covered with the liquid, and then it's airtight. And what can happen, even if it's covered with the liquid, it can be totally open. You can have it like in a crock, almost totally open, and sometimes there will be mold on the top, but then you just skim that off and you can eat what's underneath it.
Mm. Do metal lids get rusty?
Yeah, they do. They can get rusty, especially with all that activity in there. So this is a pretty new one. It doesn't have any rust on it. So you can use plastic lids. You want to scald them with hot water first, of course. You wouldn't boil the plastic lids. But yeah, over time they can get rusty, so you have to get new ones.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
So if you have any questions, more you want to find out about fermenting vegetables, there's a lot of resources out there, but some good ones to look at would be the book Wild Fermentation. Can't remember the author's name. The Body Ecology Diet book describes it also, and the cookbook Nourishing Traditions has some good recipes. So those are some references you can check out, and I hope you enjoy your fermented vegetables. Okay, so we're going to demonstrate how to make dark green, leafy green chips. Like if you've ever gotten kale chips, this is how you can make something like that at home. And I'm actually using chard. You can use any dark leafy green. You can use chard, kale. I made a really nice one with Savoy cabbage the other day. And all you need to do is tear it up into little pieces like this. And then you can add any spices you want, but I'm just doing this with salt and olive oil, making it simple. So I'm just adding, this is about 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and I'm going to go up to about 3/4 of a teaspoon. And then You add olive oil. Use a nice good quality olive oil so it tastes really good. And you add about 2 tablespoons of olive oil. Just drizzle it on. And then you can just mix it with your hands. That's the easiest way. You kind of massage it so the oil really gets into the greens. You can tear them up a little more at the same time. You can see they're already getting a little bit soft from the oil. And then you spread them out on a cookie sheet. And I put these in the oven at 140 for about 45 minutes to an hour. And then you get a nice crispy, salty, but high in vitamins and minerals chip. And that's it. And also for the time for baking these, some ovens don't go down to 140, or you know, different ovens kind of deal with things differently. So the first time you make them, you want to make sure that you watch very closely, and you take them out of the oven once they start to get crispy, and make sure that you do it on a cookie sheet in order to make sure that you have the right texture.